By March 1945, the Red Army was lined up along the river Oder, awaiting a final assault on Berlin. It presented the Allied military command in the West with a dilemma. Berlin was less than 300 miles from their advanced positions. Most Allied commanders wanted to race to the city to beat the Russians. But at a conference a month earlier in the Black Sea port of Yalta, the Allied leaders had divided up Germany into zones of influence. Berlin was firmly inside the Russian zone. So Eisenhower was instructed to tell his commanders to ignore Berlin and spread out to take the rest of the country. On April the 1st, US troops surrounded the German industrial cities in the Ruhr. German soldiers occupying the area put up a stiff resistance. When, 2 weeks later, the area fell, more than 325,000 troops were taken prisoner. It was one of the largest number of German prisoners taken in the war so far. The German commander, the die-hard Nazi Field Marshal Walter Model, committed suicide. Elsewhere in the country, resistance was more patchy, and General Bradley's armies stormed across Germany. By April the 18th, 1945, the US forces had punched a corridor through to the Czech border, splitting Germany in two. Meanwhile, north of the Ruhr, Montgomery's Canadian First Army began the liberation of Holland. The Dutch had suffered horrendously during the bitter winter of 1944-1945. The German occupying force had deliberately taken supplies of food and fuel from the country to use elsewhere. There had been widespread deaths from starvation and cold. The Dutch town of Arnhem was seized on April the 15th, 1945. Progress was rapid, and on the following day the Canadians had liberated Groningen, close to the Dutch north coast. That left a German army virtually intact, but surrounded near Amsterdam. Soon afterwards, a ceasefire was negotiated. Allied aircraft now roared over the Dutch countryside, dropping food and medical supplies. At the same time, the British Second Army, also under Montgomery's command, pushed fast across the North German plain. Osnabrück fell on April the 4th. The British were soon at the German port of Bremen. Here there was fierce German resistance. It took 9 days of house-to-house fighting before the port was secured. 2 days later, Montgomery's British forces reached the Elbe at Lauenburg. As the Allies advanced across Germany, they now came across horrific new evidence of the Nazis' final solution. In early April 1945, US troops overran a concentration camp at Ohrdruf, near Weimar, in central Germany. A visibly shocked General Eisenhower paid a visit. The SS had evacuated most of the prisoners, but they had left behind piles of bodies. Eight days later, British troops overran another concentration camp at Belsen, north of Hanover. Here they discovered over 70,000 prisoners. Thousands were already dead. The remainder were starving and disease-ridden. A radio broadcast by the BBC correspondent Richard Dimbleby gave the horrific details.
I passed through the barrier and found myself in the world of a nightmare. The living lay with their heads against the corpses, and around them moved the awful ghostly procession of emaciated, aimless people, with nothing to do and no hope of life, unable to move out of your way, unable to look at the terrible sights around them. It was as though they were waiting their turn. This is what the Germans did. Let there be no mistake about it, did deliberately and slowly.
Meanwhile, far to the south, in Italy, the German front was also starting to collapse. The German forces were dug in across the Apennine Mountains. Field Marshal Sir Harold Alexander, the Allied commander in the Mediterranean, now launched a spring offensive. On April the 9th, 1945, British troops attacked, pulling German forces in from along the front. Five days later, US troops also moved forward and swiftly reached the south bank of the River Po. The Germans retreated to the north bank. But Hitler's commander in Italy, General Heinrich von Wietinghoff, had no illusions that he could hold back the Allied advance for long. So he now made approaches to the Allies, and on April the 29th surrendered unconditionally. It would take effect from May the 2nd, 1945. This was the first formal surrender of German forces anywhere in Europe. The war was moving swiftly towards a conclusion. Back in Germany, American and Russian forces had by now met up on the Elbe near Leipzig.
The moment the world has been awaiting so long, when a lie from west meets a lie from east. The meeting was achieved on April 26, when a detachment of the American 69th Infantry Division, under Major General Reinhardt, was rowed across the Elbe to the Russians assembled on the far bank.
The stage was set for the final assault on Berlin. Hitler was desperate. He now turned to the old and very young for help in defending the city. His 1,000-year Reich was preparing for its final, apocalyptic struggle to survive. On April the 1st, 1945, Joseph Stalin summoned his top commanders to Moscow to receive their orders for the capture of Berlin. Marshal Georgi Zhukov, Russia's most successful commander, would make the main assault from his bridgehead on the Oder River. A second group of Soviet armies, under Marshal Ivan Konyev, would cross the river Neisse further south and push deep into Germany, bypassing the German capital. Between them, they represented a massive Soviet force of over 2.5 million men. They were equipped with 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 40,000 guns, mortars, and rocket launchers. But the Germans were never going to make it easy. The city was defended by about 1 million troops. Many were dug into strong defensive positions, particularly along the Silo Heights, a steep escarpment rising out of the Oder Valley and slap in front of Zhukov's point of assault. The defenders were a mixed bunch of combat veterans, SS fanatics, and inexperienced conscripts, some as young as 14, as well as elderly members of the Volkssturm, or People's Army. By now, Hitler had retired to a bunker under the Reichschancellery in Berlin. He was a heavily medicated and shambling figure who spent much of his time issuing increasingly unrealistic orders to largely imaginary armies. His public appearances were becoming ever more rare. But in early March, he was persuaded to visit some of the troops preparing to defend the Oder line. Later, in the same month, he emerged to inspect a small group of Hitler Youth soldiers. It was his last ever appearance before the cameras. Then, on April the 13th, 1945, the US President, Franklin Roosevelt, died of a heart attack. He had been one of the architects of the war, responsible for throwing America's might behind the Allied offensive. The Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, seized on the event to encourage his increasingly befuddled Führer to believe the Allied alliance would collapse. A German victory could still be snatched from the jaws of defeat. But any illusions were rapidly dispelled. 3 days after Roosevelt's death, Zhukov began his assault on Berlin. He had one gun for every 13 feet of the front. But the German defense had anticipated it and pulled back to avoid the bombardment. As a result, when Zhukov's infantry advanced, they met unexpectedly heavy resistance. Desperate to retrieve the situation, Zhukov threw in his tanks. But they too were soon bogged down. Meanwhile, to the south, the assault by Konyev's second group of armies had gone better. His troops had crossed the Neisse River and were well on their way to the next obstacle, the River Spree. Stalin stoked the rivalry between his two commanders by authorizing Konev to swing his tanks north towards Berlin. He was only too happy to see a race to take the city. After 3 days of savage fighting, Zhukov's troops managed to enter the eastern suburbs of Berlin. At the same time, Konev was approaching the city from the south. There was desperate German resistance. But on April the 25th, the Soviet armies met up and the final assault on Berlin began. As the fighting moved on from district to district, civilians began to emerge from the cellars. But the Russians took little notice of the flags of surrender. The rape of German women and girls was widespread. After 3 more days of fighting, the city's remaining defenders were pinned down in a narrow strip of central Berlin less than 2 miles wide. Every street and house was contested. Then, on the morning of April the 30th, Soviet troops began an assault on the Reichstag, the German parliament building. Stalin regarded it as the symbol of Nazi power. They were stopped by heavy fire. So they blasted the building at point-blank range with heavy artillery. That evening, the Russians stormed it. Fighting raged from room to room and up and down corridors and staircases. It would take 4 hours before the red flag could be hoisted on one of the towers. The next morning, on May the 1st, 1945, the event was restaged for the cameras. But by then, Hitler was already dead. On April the 30th, as fighting raged overhead, the man whose insane ambitions had embroiled the world in war, laid waste a continent and led to the extermination of millions of Jews, took his own life.
Sie wollten, Herr, kompromisslos die einzige Macht und alleinige Macht in Deutschland. Wir können glücklich sein zu wissen, dass diese Zukunft restlos...
His longtime mistress, Eva Braun, who he'd married the day before, died with him. Their partially burned bodies were buried in the garden of the Reichschancellery. But the fighting continued. Hitler had appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz his successor, and for the next few days the new leadership attempted to salvage something from its nation's cataclysmic defeat. On May the 1st, 1945, the day after his death, German people were told that their Führer had fallen in battle. But they were told to continue the fight against the Bolshevik menace. But the German leadership was falling apart. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann tried to negotiate a city-wide ceasefire with the Russians. But the Russian commander, Marshal Zhukov, demanded unconditional surrender of all German forces everywhere. It was more than Goebbels and Bormann could deliver. Fighting in Berlin continued. Later that evening, Goebbels and his wife killed their 6 children and then committed suicide themselves. That same night, Bormann disappeared. Eventually, in the 1990s, DNA testing confirmed that a body found in Berlin was his. The next morning, Berlin surrendered. By mid-afternoon, all fighting in the city had stopped. Across the country, the pace of the German surrender now gathered momentum. The following day, Dönitz sent a delegation to the British commanding officer, Field Marshal Montgomery. He offered to surrender all German forces in northern Germany. Montgomery sent a reply saying he didn't have the authority to accept a surrender on behalf of the Americans or the Russians. He could only accept the surrender of those troops fighting him. Dönitz had no choice but to agree to Montgomery's terms. But that left Germany still fighting in the rest of the country. Dönitz now sent another delegation to General Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, to discuss a peace deal with the West, but it carefully avoided any reference to a surrender to the Russians. Eisenhower rebuffed him and insisted that only the unconditional surrender of all German forces was acceptable. Once again, Dönitz was forced to back down. At 2:41 in the morning of May the 7th, 1945, at Eisenhower's headquarters in France, General Alfred Jodl, Hitler's chief of operations throughout the 6 years of war, signed a document of unconditional surrender. Eisenhower's chief of staff, Walter Bedell Smith, signed for the Western Allies. General Ivan Suslopurov signed for the Soviet Union. The only member of the Allies' side not happy with the arrangement was Stalin. The Soviet Union had suffered too much to miss out on its own humiliation of the Germans. So Stalin countermanded Suslopurov and declared Russia would only accept a surrender in Berlin. It meant that the following day, Hitler's former chief of staff, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, signed a second surrender document to satisfy Stalin. Marshal Zhukov signed for the Soviet Union, with Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder signing on behalf of the Western Allies.
In January 1943, the late President Roosevelt and Premier Churchill met in Casablanca. There they pronounced the formula of unconditional surrender for the Axis powers. In Europe, that formula has now been fulfilled.
Across Europe and the United States, crowds began to celebrate the end of the war in Europe. From now on, the day after the German surrender, May the 8th, would be known as VE Day, Victory in Europe. But as the celebrations continued, many were aware of two very sobering issues. In the East, Japan was still fighting. And in Europe, the continent lay in ruins, and huge problems needed to be solved. Millions of Germany's concentration camp victims and slave laborers would need help to rebuild their lives. Millions of captured German fighting men had to be screened before being allowed to go home to identify and arrest major war criminals. The SS was a particular target. It had been responsible for some of the worst atrocities of the war. Leading Nazis like Hermann Göring, head of Hitler's Air Force, were rounded up and paraded in front of the cameras. Other top Nazis arrested included civilian leaders like Albert Speer and military leaders like Jodl and Dönitz. They would be put on trial in the German city of Nuremberg for crimes against humanity.
You must plead guilty or not guilty. Bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig. Rudolf Hess, you must plead guilty or not guilty. Nein. That will be entered as a plea of not guilty.
The Nazi leadership received sentences ranging from the death penalty to 10 years in prison. Göring committed suicide before he could be hung. Two months after the German surrender, the Allies met in the Berlin suburb of Potsdam. Germany was divided into 4 zones of occupation: Soviet, British, American, and French. Berlin, although deep in the Soviet zone, was parceled up between the Allies in the same way. The peoples of Europe would also find themselves divided. Some would now live under the control of the Western Allies, some under Communist Russia. But before any of this could be faced, there was still the war in the Pacific to be won.
One weapon dominates modern warfare: rockets. Cruise missiles can home in on terrorist bases anywhere in the world. Overshadowing these are intercontinental ballistic missiles tipped with nuclear warheads, the weapons of last resort. Even a single infantryman can call on the power of handheld rockets to knock out armored vehicles. All these weapon systems have their roots in World War II. For their inventors, their development was a fascinating adventure.
It looked just tremendous, looked very, very beautiful. Beautiful shape, and it was standing there very quiet, and there was a little steam coming out somewhere. And then there came the ignition, and that was just a tremendous impression. It was an ocean of flames and smoke that came out, and the thundering noise was so that one didn't hear through the ears only, but through the whole body, everything vibrated.
Rockets have a long history. Using gunpowder, the medieval Chinese first used them to terrify Mongol raiders. Sir William Congreve introduced them to European warfare in 1805, but his batteries of rockets were notoriously unreliable, sometimes doubling back to attack the launcher. So they remained a minor weapon system until the beginning of World War II. Only when rockets could be guided accurately would they become a major force on the battlefield. German scientists were the pioneers. In 1923, Hermann Oberth wrote The Rocket into Interplanetary Space. He also formed the Society for Space Travel, a group of gifted amateur scientists which included an 18-year-old engineering student, Wernher von Braun. In 1930, they successfully launched a small rocket powered by liquid oxygen and petrol. 4 years later, this was followed by two fueled with liquid oxygen and alcohol. The rocket age had begun, and already it was being considered as an aggressive weapon that could deliver an explosive warhead. Adolf Hitler had been in power in Germany for almost 2 years. He was determined to avenge the humiliation of defeat in World War I and was keen to encourage his military scientists. The German armed forces had shown an interest in rocketry as an alternative to long-range artillery even before the Nazis came to power. In 1930, Captain Walter Dornberger had been put in charge of the Army's ballistic research. 6 years later, von Braun became his technical director, his first step to fame as the father of the American space program. At Peenemünde, on the deserted Baltic beaches of northern Germany, they tested their new invention. The project was top secret.
I had no idea what Peenemünde was, where it was, what was happening there. I asked a number of my friends and acquaintances. Nobody knew. So I was very surprised to see there a kind of a factory establishment in the middle of this isolated island. I went in through the gate and was channeled to a person, and he took a piece of paper and drew a sketch of the rocket for me. And I said, for heaven's sake, is it that big a rocket? And he said, yes, it is.
Maintaining the equilibrium of such a large rocket at takeoff was particularly difficult. And to achieve their full potential, rockets would have to reach enormously high speeds. To some, this seemed a fundamental problem.
There were, of course, many scientists at the time who said, with the human-built article, you just cannot penetrate the sound barrier. But, of course, von Braun was still convinced that it could be done. After all, ammunition which has the same aerodynamic shape as a A4, flies at supersonic speed. So von Braun and most of the technicians, including myself, working in Peenemünde, were convinced that it could be done.
The early rockets were unguided as well as unstable. Von Braun and his team were convinced that gyroscopes could be the solution to both problems. But there were many setbacks, and one spectacular failure almost destroyed the test center.
Second generation of the inertial guidance system would be the gyro-stabilized platform. It's actually a mechanical frame carrying 3 gyroscopes on the platform. The platform itself is mounted in the rocket so that it can move in 3 directions, and the 3 gyros work together to keep that platform very stable in space. It will always keep its direction, its position, its attitude, no matter how the rocket moves around it.
The gyroscopes were linked to rudders, which use the engine's blast to correct the rocket's attitude and maintain its direction. This was the forerunner of all rocket guidance systems. Once it had been perfected, the development of ever larger and more accurate missiles could move ahead. Finally, a high-explosive warhead was placed in the nose of the rocket. By 1940, Dornberger and von Braun were confident enough to tell their Führer that he would have a working rocket by 1943. But Hitler had other ideas. His first year of blitzkrieg warfare had been a complete triumph, giving him an empire stretching from Poland to France. He could see little point in wasting money on experimental weapon research and cancelled the rocket program. Despite this, Dornberger and von Braun believed passionately in their revolutionary weapon and kept working on it, unofficially. In October 1942, they launched an A4 rocket that flew faster and higher than any previously tested, over 125 miles, reaching an altitude of 53 miles and landing within 2.5 miles of its intended target. The era of the ballistic missile was born. Explosives could now be delivered over hundreds of miles to a chosen spot. By 1943, Hitler was no longer the unbeatable warlord. Crucial defeats in North Africa and Russia made him look for new wonder weapons which might restore his fortune, and rockets seemed among the most promising. But the first of his rocket-propelled weapons launched against Britain was not Dornberger and von Braun's ballistic missile, but a much simpler weapon, developed by a rival army project team. The V-1 was a pilotless aircraft with an explosive warhead. In looks and performance, it was an ancestor of today's cruise missiles. V-1s were powered up a ramp by a rocket motor. When they reached 250 miles per hour, the motor fell away and a ramjet took over. A 2,000-pound warhead could be carried up to 100 miles, and there was a simple guidance system. When the bomb had traveled a preset distance, the engine cut, and the bomb went into an unstoppable and lethal dive. From June 1944, over 2,000 V-1s were launched at London from ramps in northern France. It was a second blitz. Over 5,000 civilians were killed. Londoners nicknamed the V-1 the Doodlebug, or buzz bomb, because of its distinctive engine sound. When the noise stopped, they knew with dreadful certainty that an explosion was just seconds away. But the V-1s had a major weakness. Because they flew at a constant speed and altitude in a straight line, it was relatively easy for anti-aircraft gunners to shoot them down. The British also sent their fastest aircraft after them. The new Meteor jet fighter tracked and destroyed flying bombs as soon as they showed up on radar screens. Allied aircrew also learned to tip flying bombs off course. Hitler now pinned his hopes on Dornberger and von Braun's faster and more devastating missile. Their A4 rocket was renamed the V2, V for Vengeance. Its development was given top priority. Could it turn the tide of war back in their Führer's favor? Spring 1944. The Allies prepare to invade Nazi-occupied Europe. The days of the Third Reich are numbered, but still, Hitler believed he could win the war. He had a new secret weapon, the V2 ballistic missile. This could launch a devastating bombardment of London. Britain might yet be forced to surrender. The V2 was 46 feet long and weighed more than 13 tons, including a 1-ton explosive warhead. Powered by a mix of liquid alcohol and liquid oxygen, it reached an altitude of over 300,000 feet and plunged back to Earth at almost 2,000 miles per hour, too fast for the Allies to intercept it. Its maximum range of 205 miles took less than 4 minutes. By early 1944, 2 massive concrete and steel bunkers were completed in northern France. From these, Hitler planned to fire V2s at London at a rate of 2 every hour. The bunkers were totally impervious to conventional bombs, but in May the Royal Air Force used a specially developed 20,000-pound version of the Tallboy bomb on them. Both were completely destroyed before a single V2 had been launched. But the danger had not been removed, for the V2 was not dependent on fixed sights. From September 1944, over 1,000 were fired at Britain from mobile batteries in Holland. The results were terrifying. Death came without warning. No air raid siren or telltale engine noise, just instant oblivion. The British had thought victory was in sight, when suddenly Londoners were exposed to a level of danger not felt since the dark days of 1940.
One evening I left my digs at Wimpole Street, and before I had closed the blackout curtains, I was looking in the direction across Wimpole Street, and I saw a building which had a pub in the ground floor, and I think 2 or 3 other floors above, actually rise up intact and gradually fall apart in the air.
A continuous, deadly rain of V2s hit London until March 1945. Over 10,000 civilians died. Only when the Allied advance cleared Holland were the mobile batteries finally silenced. Hitler's scientists had been working on even more ambitious missiles, but none of these ever reached their full potential. The A-10 would have been the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile. A two-stage rocket consisting of a booster lifting a V2, it could have reached almost 3,000 miles, bringing the cities of the eastern United States within range. Instead, it was the cities of the Third Reich which were steadily reduced to rubble by the Allied bombing offensive. Rockets were used to power the Comet manned interceptor, but it was difficult to fly, and too few skilled pilots were available. So Germany's scientists turned to developing the world's first anti-aircraft missiles. First to be tested was the Henschel HS-117 Schmetterling. It was guided to its target by radio control. But by the time test flights were completed in late 1944, it was too late to put the missile into full production. A similar guidance system had been developed for air-launched ground attack missiles like the Henschel HS-293. An aimer used a radio control-linked joystick to guide the missile to its target. The weapon's first combat success came on August the 25th, 1943, when a Dornier 217, armed with two Henschel missiles, spotted a British sub-hunter in the Bay of Biscay. The system worked perfectly and scored a direct hit. The missile ignited the ship's magazine and blew HMS Egret apart, with the loss of 222 lives. The Germans were far more advanced in developing guided missiles, but they were never able to exploit this fully. The Allies, in contrast, produced a variety of less advanced but lethal unguided weapons. For the Russians, artillery was the god of war. Their truck-mounted Katyusha had been in development before the war. It could fire 16 missiles in a devastating barrage equivalent to that of a whole gun battery. The Germans swiftly responded with their fearsome six-barreled Nebelwerfer. The Western Allies, too, used rockets for bombardment, both on land, at sea, and in the air, where they made a new breed of high-speed ground attack aircraft, such as the British Hawker Typhoon, into highly effective tank killers. The Typhoon carried 2 racks of 4 rockets fitted with either 60-pound high-explosive or 25-pound armor-piercing warheads. From 1944 onwards, Allied tank busters roamed across northwest Europe, hunting for enemy vehicles or strongpoints. Ground down under this onslaught, the German army found it almost impossible to move by day. Tanks had dominated the battlefield from the early days of the war, and rockets also gave individual infantrymen a means of tackling them when air support was not available. The rocket-propelled grenade, or RPG, was developed in 1942 by 2 Americans and nicknamed the bazooka. Its armor-busting punch came from a hollow charged shell mounted on a rocket motor and launched from a steel tube. The bazooka needed a team of 2, one to load and the other to aim and fire. It had a range of 150 yards. It first saw action in Tunisia in 1943, and there it proved encouragingly effective. But as German tanks became more heavily armoured, bazooka crewmen had to show enormous daring in getting close to their targets. The Germans swiftly countered with a simpler version of the RPG called the Panzerfaust. This could be used by one man and became the main anti-tank weapon used by German soldiers towards the end of the war. But it had to be used at an almost suicidal range of just 32 yards. The Germans went on to develop larger versions of the RPG. But as their war machine ran short of tanks and artillery, it was barely trained men armed with the basic Panzerfaust who were expected to halt the waves of Russian T-34 tanks coming from the east. It was an impossible task. As the war ended, all the victors realized that rockets and their capacity to deliver death with deadly accuracy from a great distance were the way forward. Dornberger, von Braun and their fellow scientists were rounded up in 1945 and hurried off to the United States or the Soviet Union. Their Nazi past was airbrushed out of history as they helped both sides develop the massive rockets which dominated the Cold War. In public, von Braun now looked to a peaceful future.
To put people on the moon and with enough fuel to enable them to return safely home to Earth requires a still larger and more powerful rocket, however.
But in reality, they were all driven by the same urge as the pioneering scientists on both sides during World War II. The quest to find ever more deadly weapons. The same weapons which dominate military tactics and strategy today.